looking up dates and researchers, ethnic groups, even cell colors. Yet saying aliens are fairies is not a part of archaeology. Hello, and welcome to another wonderful and amazing episode of Goblinological Fantasies. I'm the mayor of Goblintown, and I have with me Dr. Alex Fitzpatrick, a researcher at the Science Museum in London with a PhD in archaeology, specialty in zooarchaeology, and podcaster extraordinaire. Actually part of the Archaeological Podcasting Network with Archaeo Animals. So everybody applause! Yay! Okay. My first question, okay, let's the zooarchaeology. So what is zooarchaeology? How's it different than just regular zoology and just regular archaeology?
Well, I mean, it differs from zoology in that the animals are dead. So I think that's like a major difference. I mean, it's very you can kind of get from the name. So zooarchaeology is the study of animals, so specifically non-human animals and species in the archaeological record. Um, Something that I mainly came to because I am not scared of human remains. It's just that I find them more difficult because there's more expectations. And with animal remains, I feel like people are just really happy that you can tell the difference between like a cat and a dog. And I'm here for those low expectations, to be honest.
Well, okay, I think I heard about some. You're discussing this before, right? If you are specializing in just human remains, you're just doing one species, but you have to do all the species. So, hats off to you.
But yeah, I mean, I've always found it a bit more interesting, to be honest. There's a lot more you can talk about and think about because you're not thinking about just nature and just kind of more natural things, what in the environments were like in the past. But you're also thinking about that kind of human animal relationship as well and how it's extremely varied. You're not just thinking about food or, you're not just thinking about domestication. You're thinking about things like ritual. You're thinking about culture and folklore. You're thinking about symbolism. So there's like loads of different ways you can look at it. And I find that, especially as someone coming from an anthropology background as well, I find that a lot more interesting than human remains, which are just bones. I mean, they're all bones, but
Well, okay. No, I love that answer because that actually kind of echoes and rhymes with my last interview with Dr. Yasui, which we talked about subsistence and we talked about the term hunter gatherer. And she pointed out that we don't usually like to refer to people as just their sort of economic model that they use, as just like hunter gathering. We don't refer to people as just capitalists. We sort of want to refer to them more holistically, right? And in your case, you're doing the animals and then interaction between animals and humans and the environment, and you mentioned ritual, right? Like we're doing these things not just because we need to eat or things are efficient calorie wise, but we're doing this because we kind of want to, right? It's our culture to do so.
Mhm.
Since you have such a broad view when looking at a site and looking at you know the material remains of whatever it is that you have, um, like describe to us that process. And what I'm getting at is like, what is taphonomy?
So like I think the easiest way to like describe taphonomy is that it's basically like what happens to things and how they end up in the archaeological record, and even beyond that, which is extremely broad, concept, right? I think a lot of people, when they use the term taphonomy, are really speaking about what happens to remains once they're in the ground, but more kind of not more recent work, but like I think that idea has really been expanded upon in the last couple decades. So you can break it down to like several sections. So you have kind of biotic processes of taphonomy, which are things that happen even before the person or the animal dies. So it's why do they exist in this site? What are the regional characteristics that make this site a good habitat for an animal per se, or what's the seasonal kind of factors that cause an animal to migrate to this section of a region or whatever. And then you have fanatic processes. Those are the ones that actually cause the death. So, hunting, injuries, illnesses, big bonk on the head, all those things that cause death. That is part of the taphonomic process as well, because it's dead. It's now going to be part of the archaeological record. You have at this point it gets kind of funky. There's a lot of weird things happening. You have your perthotaxic processes, which is kind of movement and destruction of remains. So, if an animal runs across the remains that are on the ground, that's part of that taphonomy. Even things like butchery, that counts in perthotaxic processes, burning, gnawing on bone. All these things cause characteristics that you can see once we dig these remains up.
Oh, okay, I wanted to pause you on the gnawing. I think that's going to be an important part, right? Because that's really a big part of your research into Cowsea Caves, right? Like the gnawing of bones that are there by like cats and dogs and things like that, and then trying to identify what kind of cat or what kind of dog it was.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, the gnawing stuff's really interesting because it help like you said, it helps you understand what species are interacting with the dead, and I think that's an important part of taphonomy that some people kind of, particularly people who aren't really zooarchaeologists, may kind of forget, that it's not just humans who are interacting with the dead, it's also animals. There are scavenging animals who will just gnaw on bone, who will collect bones. This isn't really my field of study, but say hyenas are massive scavengers and create these kind of assemblages of bone that are really strange if you don't realize that it's a hyena that's creating it. So yeah, it's a real gnawing in particular, and scavenging practices are a really interesting taphonomic processes. There's also a bunch of other processes that I don't get into as much because I'm not an archaeological scientist, at least in that sense. So like taphic ones are like the chemical processes where you do like histology and micro analysis of bone to see bioerosion. And I don't I'm not a nerd. No, it's never, as someone who's famously failed a lot of chemistry classes, not my thing. So I just hand those off to someone else to do. So it's not really my focus in the research I've done. You have anataxic, which is basically the perthotaxic stuff that happens when you move bones. So for Cowsea Caves, that's actually kind of important. We have a lot of cases of bones being taken from one place and put to another place. So the things that happen in that transition period are also part of the taphonomic process. And then you get really expansive. And it's not really something I ever focus on, but I always find it really interesting that people consider it part of taphonomy, which is the pelagic and trophic processes. Those two are actually about the archaeology itself. So pelagic is the excavation decisions. So you're sampling, you're sieving of bone from your soil heap material. That's considered more of an expansive taphonomic process. And then your trophic process is your post-excavation work. So how you sort, record, and store bones. It's something that I think a lot of people really don't think about, but it impacts what we have available, especially for people who do archaeology based on archival materials. Because, let's be honest, a lot of archaeologists kind of keep your bones in a box somewhere, and then 30 years later, a PhD student tackles it. And, that's going to impact how they interpret that because of what still remains. And in my case, that actually impacted my PhD because Sylvia Benton, bless her, the first archaeologist to excavate in the 1930s, the Cowsea Caves, or Sculptor's Cave specifically, she kind of tossed out her animal bone.
Oh no.
So that was so I had to base it on records. I really wish she didn't do that, but it's fine. Times change in the way we approach animal remains, but that is a process that really impacted interpretation.
I think I remember reading that line in your dissertation. I'm like, oh no. That that reminds me again, going back to my last interview with Dr. Yasui. She was going back through some of the records to go through data for analysis, and she was going over some data from like a from when the dig was like in the 1970s, like 1976. But the problem is all those records were on floppy disks,
Oh gosh.
and it's like, oh. um, so yeah, people remember that archaeology. When you study a site, you destroy the site. So be very careful, and let's do a favor for everybody who comes after us.
Yeah, don't throw
Um,
away your bones, please, unless you've had them really well recorded and potentially even scanned. Thank you.
the lab people will love you for it. Uh, you mentioned cowsea caves, and we're slowly working our way toward cowsea caves. So actually, let's go ahead and describe this area. Right, this is northern Scotland, right? This site that you studied.
Yeah, so it's northeast Scotland. It's on the coast of the Moray Firth. It's close to Elgin, which you may know because of the Elgin marbles.
Uh,
That's where the name comes from. Well, they're not really the Elgin marbles, but you know what I mean.
I
Um,
kept seeing that name, and I'm like, is that the marbles? But this is like a really different place.
yeah, I can't remember the actual specifics of why that is, but I do know that's why that
Okay.
is. So apologies to the people of Elgin for not remembering that. But it's a really hard place to get to. That was kind of the bane of my life, to the point that I fell off a boulder on my first day, and I was stranded in the cave for 5 hours before I can get to the emergency room.
Didn't you
For
break a bone or something?
I didn't. That's the worst part of that story because it was very dramatic. I'd fallen off this boulder. Everyone's freaking out. We're like halfway to the cave. The high tide is coming. We can't leave the cave until the tide goes out. So we're stuck in this cave. I have my arm in a sling, for like 5 hours. I have to like still scale the side of a cliff to get back up because there's no way to get me out. Like I'm still able to kind of move. We finally get to the emergency room. Apparently, I was like the first person ever on this site to have to go get medical attention. And then they do X-rays, and they're like, "Yeah, I guess you just bruised and hurt a nerve, and you're fine." And I was just like, I would have, at least if it was like a broken bone, the drama was warranted. Now it's like, oh, the baby got a boo boo.
Dr. Fitzpatrick, do not tell it that way. Then when you tell people that story, I want you to make it Indiana Jones. You're like, I was in excruciating pain. The tide is coming in. I'm about to drown.
I mean, the boulder does get bigger and bigger with each telling, don't worry. But it was very much like, oh. But I mean, it was one of those things where I don't think I did it in the thesis, but my supervisor was like, you should just put a picture of yourself with your sling on in your thesis to be like, this is how dangerous it is to get there. Uh, it's phenomenology. It's me experiencing archaeology. It's fine. It's all theoretical methodology.
That I think that's an important illustration about this cave, right? That in your discussion of it in your paper, this is a difficult place to get to. It is a cave that faces the ocean, and there's just a thin strip of land, right? That kind of between the cave and the ocean, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it creates this sort of liminal space, and the difficulty of getting to the cave. And this is a series of caves, right? Creates this special place for whatever happened here. I assume we're basically assuming ritual, but we don't know exactly what ritual. And some of the remains that you found there were domestic animals. So I think that's kind of interesting. Is why would they be there, or why would any animals be, or anything be there if it's just so difficult to get to?
Yeah, I mean that's like the first flag up, for the importance of this site. If it was a regular kind of cave that's just open and really easy to get there, if you found a cow remains or something, you could easily say, "Oh, a cow wandered in and died." But with how difficult it is to get to these caves, I mean, I'd love to see a cow try to get into these caves by itself. It may be possible, but it's highly unlikely. So, like, that's the first red flag as far as, there has to be something else going on. And obviously, looking at the bones and seeing that there was butchery going on and selective processes and things like that, obviously there was human interactions with these remains and human uses for these remains. And as you said, that's a very liminal space. So all these things really point to, some kind of important cultural significance of this site. Whether or not that's ritual, it's that archaeology joke, everything is ritual, right? So, you know, but it's true though. There might be a ritual element. The fact that there are human remains in the site kind of help that interpretation. So, if anything, it is a funerary site. That's where the kind of analysis I did, the taphonomic analysis, was really important, because it's like, well, if we're finding all these animals, how do they get there? So seeing all these kind of processing evidence and kind of being able to figure out, okay, so people are clearly, chopping up animals, which makes it easier to move, and then either further chopping them up in sites for specific uses, whether it's for consuming them, for using them as tools, for even using them as some kind of, ritual offering, something like that. We really can't tell per se, but yeah, I mean, that all these things kind of, and I think what I really like about this site is that it's a really nice encapsulation of how the archaeological interpretation process works, in that, it's all these little things, right, that add up. Okay, so it's hard to get animals there. Okay, so all these animals have butchery marks. Okay, there's human remains here too. What do these mean together? And that's how you create that interpretation and that archaeological narrative. So it's like a creative writing process almost, but you have a lot of kind of like more grounded evidence to kind of point to, and be like, okay, so there's red deer in these caves. Now, red deer are really big, and they'd probably be really hard to get there naturally by themselves. Okay, if we look a little bit closer, the red deer are a bit chopped up, and there's only certain parts of the red deer in these caves. Okay, so then they're clearly being processed and brought into these caves for a specific reason. Okay, that there's a lot of, cranial bits. Are they taking the antlers and putting it somewhere else because they're not here? Things like that. It's like a logic puzzle, and it was a really good kind of way to work that through, particularly as a PhD student, getting used to creating a narrative in a very kind of major part of the research. If that makes sense.
One of the points that I had never thought about, right? When you were talking about that you were finding just the feet off of animals, which is really weird. Like, why would you just find feet? And then your explanation was, well, because that's when you skin the animal, you kind of leave the feet there, and then you cut like up the leg and around the body, and you peel it back, and you just have the skin with the legs hanging off of it, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And I think the importance of your research is like you're not just telling us, okay, there's not just bones. It's now this is most likely skinning, butchery, possibly feasting, maybe mummy bundles, right? That sort of interpretation. That was really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's like a really interesting domino effect, right? So you just kind of you narrow things down, but then you have this domino effect of like you said. So looking at quantifying the animal remains, you're going, okay, there's a lot of like feet bones. That's weird. And then thinking it through, being like, okay, well, why would there be feet bones? Well, feet are normally found when you skin an animal. And then doing the kind of comparative research and thinking about, okay, well, there's a practice in some parts of later prehistoric Scotland, and later prehistoric Britain, of mummification, of preserving human remains through mummy bundles. It's something that was theorized at Sculptor's Cave. Clearly, those two things match up. So yeah, I mean, like I said, it's like a logic puzzle, and I always find that kind of thing really satisfying. So yeah, it's definitely again, I think that goes back to like why I like zooarchaeology, because of all those kind of things and elements that pop up and can be part of your narrative because of how expansive the use and relationships of humans and animals over time in particular.
So let's go back to domestication. So I'm sure there's going to be like a really like short, small definition, like a really terse definition you could give me. But there's another part of domestication that I'm probably going to want to ask. So, but first off, just give us what's the definition of domestication?
I mean, I guess realistically, it's like a process of kind of influence of one species over another that potentially benefits them both. It happens over a long period of time and basically takes, a wild animal and creates into a domesticated animal, which is more or less a completely different species. The more complex answer, though, is that it is ultimately a relationship between two species, and this goes for animals and plants, and it's sustained throughout generations, through continuation of kind of care, of influence over breeding practices. And it is like an extremely complicated concept. And it's something that I think as archaeologists and as people who work on this kind of research need to be better at explaining to the general public, because one of my biggest pet peeves is when people say like, oh look, this person domesticated a lion or something, and
Oh, good golly, Tiger King, I might cry. Um,
yeah, it's like it's so complicated, and it's one of those things where you really wish that there was a bit more public outreach being done to kind of hone in on how complicated this is. And I think it would also probably help with a lot of weird humanal. Wow. I think it would, really help with the kind of problematic human interactions with animals that we've been seeing on social media, like over the last couple of years.
I like that word humanimal. That's pretty good.
Humanal,
Uh,
yes.
um, I think it's kind of funny that you said like, okay, two animals or something like that, or an animal gets another animal to work for them, and I'm like, hey, wait, isn't there a honey bird that gets humans to get like break open logs so that it can eat honey? That's in Africa. So I'm like, oh wait, did they domesticate us?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, and that's why I stress that it's a very complicated process, and not just like humans take animals and make them do what they want to do, because it is, there's a lot of research being done looking at. I mean, even in zooarchaeology, there's research being done looking at, was domestication actually not necessarily something that humans instigated, but something that was kind of co-instigated between non-human species and humans. There's a lot of people always say, cats basically domesticated us. Um, it's it's definitely not as clean cut and dry as we make animals do things. So that's obviously kind of the overlying main idea of domestication that we have. um, it's just really interesting. It is very much a relationship, and I think that's the best way to look at it. Is it's a relationship that changes over time, that gets more complex over time. And like I said, that's the part of domestication that I think people don't realize is you really end up with like almost a completely different animal. So you hear stories of like, oh, we should let my cat go out and live in the wild. It's like, your cat's probably going to die because your cat is not the same wild cat that existed thousands of years ago. I mean, the cats are probably a bad example because they might do okay, but you know what I mean? Like, you can't just like let out, you can't just let out a domesticated animal into the wild and be like, now it's going to be a wild animal. No, it's going to be a domesticated animal that's very lost and confused, and doesn't know what to do, because it's a different animal at the end of the day. Your cattle is not your auroch, as much as we'd like it to be.
I mean, imagine again going back to a previous interview with Dr. Miniti, right? It's if you put a pug dog out in the wild, I don't think it's gonna do very well.
No, unfortunately. I mean, that pug dog is doing its best to begin with.
um, I uh, I don't know. I really want to interview Katrina Van Grau. I bought her book Unnatural Selection, and it really goes over a lot of the plasticity of animals, right? Like if you have dogs, right, a pug, a corgi, a Great Dane, Saint Bernard, a Greyhound, all of these are breeds of dog. Technically the same species, but if you look at them, like if a person didn't know, they're like, that's not the same animal anymore. We've done a lot of things to animals, in part of this domestication process.
Yeah, no, it's something where it's like, I wonder if, let's say, all of human written record gets lost, and then you have, alien zooarchaeologists or whatever come and look at our dog remains. Would they just simply go, those are all different species, right? Like, they might come from the same family, but they cannot be the same animal, right?
Some of the other questions then is, what are some of the earliest examples of animal domestication? And then like why? Why would it happen?
So yeah, I think dogs are probably the earliest that we know of. So like, the hard thing about answering these questions is that we're constantly getting new research, particularly genetic research, that pushes the years back. So I mean, you know, the years that I would have said of how long it's been since dogs were domesticated, like 5 years ago, would probably be quite different to what I'm telling you now, which is great. It's amazing, but I feel like when you're writing research, this is very annoying. I mean, when I did my PhD, we were on the cusp of looking at the domestication of chicken, and I was so obsessed with finding an even earlier chicken in the assemblage we were working on, and we found a chicken in what was supposed to be our later prehistoric assemblage, and I was so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. I'm gonna be like, in nature. Like to help find the earliest chicken in Britain. No, it turns out there was like it was a mix up. The context got mixed up. It was actually like a medieval period. I was so upset about it. But where it speaks to the fact that we're still constantly learning new things about it. But to get to the actual question, so yeah, dogs are probably like the first animal that was domesticated, so that we're thinking about 15,000, 20,000 years ago. Like I said, it really does keep changing. I think it originally was like 15,000 years ago, and now there's been the last couple of years been research saying maybe it's more like 20,000 years ago. I mean, there's been some research that I don't think has really been followed up on, where like the biggest expansion point was like up to like 42,000 years ago, which I think stretching it a bit, but like, it shows how long domestication one takes, but also how long it's been around. But livestock wise, I think it's like goats and sheep, so they were probably domesticated about 10,000 years ago. But then you have these like really big gaps as well, so it's not like you domesticated a dog and we're like, okay, I'm gonna domesticate all these other things. No, it like takes so much time, and the reason why it happens is, I mean, part of it is really because of need. So the dog thing is more, I think, due to kind of, humans were starting to like settle together, group together, even if they weren't settling per se, they were traveling together, and, dogs were kind of coming up because, oh, who's leaving all this food behind, things like that. That's a very like base way to kind of explain that, but it's something similar to that. Whereas your livestock, that was really coming around because agriculture happened. People were actually settling down. They realized we don't actually have to like do hunt and gather as our main form of subsistence. We might be able to actually kind of domesticate crops, domesticate species. So yeah, sheep and goats were probably the first ones, I think, in Asia. I mean, all these, I feel like all these domestication stories happened in Asia, and then they just kind of spread.
Well, because you mentioned dogs in 20,000 years ago, and I'm like, wait, like Americans, like the indigenous people of Americas had dogs, right? So they had to have had dogs at least by the time they were crossing Beringia. So I'm like, it's at least 20,000. Um, that's just would just be my guess, and it helps that it starts in Asia because it's a little bit closer. You used the example of the dog. The dog. The guess is that dogs were scavenging off of the refuse from human settlements, and eventually the two populations in physical proximity eventually became, joined together at the hip, um, like domesticating each other or entering into that domestication relationship. But the thing is, though, for archaeology, how were you able to see that in the archaeological record? Do you see like wolf bones and then they slowly become dog bones over time? Like, how does that happen?
So yeah, I mean, part of this is why it's partially kind of not guesswork. Guesswork's not the right word, but it's like, we are working on very minimal evidence. It's actually funny. I had a conversation with a colleague who's a historian the other day, and we were talking about we were reading a piece and talking about it, and they were saying, they were giving some they were giving some criticism, basically saying like, oh, this piece doesn't have as much evidence for the kind of claims it's making. And I was just like, it's funny because coming from archaeology, that's like loads of evidence in comparison to what we work with sometimes. Because, especially when you're working later prehistoric and even, way, way before that, you're not working with written text, you're working with literally sometimes dirt. And now, of course, technological advances means that we can get a lot more information out of that dirt, but it's not the same as, having, this text and this record and this thing. But yeah, to get back to your question, a lot of what we end up needing to use is kind of genetic work. Ancient DNA has been such a huge, and the reason why there's been like such a burst of domestication research over the past decade or so is because ancient DNA techniques have advanced so much that we are able to do that. There's, it's one of those things though where like, because of, let's, going back to Cowsea Caves, that is a site that was being used from the Neolithic to the post-medieval period. That's a huge amount of time to look at. So if I find some bones from the medieval period, I compare them to bones from the early Neolithic, I might be able to compare them and be like, okay, this one's not as domesticated as that one, because they're, like I said, they're basically two different species. When it gets funny, so like the later prehistoric, where you're seeing domestication happen, but there's still obviously lots of wolves around, and they're not fully domesticated in that they look so distinct, like a modern day dog. That's when you have to kind of go and get ancient DNA work done. I mean, that's what I did. I basically shipped them off, and I was like, "Please tell me you can make a decision." And unfortunately, in my case, they couldn't, which was very depressing. And like I said, working in that cusp area, of thousands of years, where it's like it could be either or, was really frustrating because the interpretation changes so much, right? The difference between a wolf being in proximity to humans and a dog, two different stories you're telling. So that was annoying, but it's cool though that we have this ability to really start pinpointing very specifically, oh, this is where it is in domestication, like that process, because like you say, it's not really something you can look at morphologically unless you're looking at like one end or the other.
What you're talking about is also an issue that paleontologists have, which is that
Mm,
behavior doesn't get preserved.
of
Yeah.
course.
So at least in the middle, right, when they're sort of half domesticated, really the difference is not DNA per se, it's behavior at that point. So then
Mm-hmm.
that becomes a kind of difficult thing. What I'm wondering then is there a specific kind of animal that gets domesticated, or is it just like all over the place?
I mean, it really is like what animals are kind of useful to us. And again, it's not just humans. It's whatever animal is useful to that animal, right? So, for livestock, it's kind of like, well, if you domesticate cow, if you keep cow around, if you have them nearby, first of all, you can use them for labor, they can be beasts of burden, you can use them for meat, you can also milk them. It's that the over time, these realizations of the things that animals can produce as products to humans, that's kind of that leads to that more elongated domestication process of, okay, we're actually going to care for these animals because we realize how useful they are, which is a very utilitarian kind of explanation, but it is probably very truthful in a lot of ways. But of course, there's also, like I said, let's say if cats really did domesticate humans, it's because of the usefulness of us. We give them food, we leave food behind. That's really nice. What if we, cozy up to them a bit more? And I don't love those explanations because I don't want to rely on these very utilitarian kind of approaches to it. But I think they are kind of a baseline of what the reasons are. There's lots of other things happening as well. Probably it's the benefits really that get identified, I think, and seeing those benefits over time and realizing, maybe we should take more, maybe we should take care of these animals, maybe we should keep them closer to us. Those decisions add up over thousands of years, and now we have my cat that was having zoomies about 5 minutes ago, and it was really annoying.
I, perhaps an example of a domesticated animal that doesn't have an immediate utilitarian use or utilitarian value would be goldfish. I mean, they're there. We did it. If you put them in a river, they wouldn't last very long because we domesticated them to make them look pretty and shiny. And the problem is looking pretty and shiny like that means it's really easy to see you and get eaten. So,
But yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that doesn't really get thought of right away when you think of why would you want an animal nearby. You immediately think of those utilitarian kind of reasons, for food, for labor, for things like that. But then there's also because it looks pretty, because it's cute, because it's nice, it gives me comfort, why pets exist. It's something that I always think about with archaeology more generally, which is that curiosity that I think people forget about. I think some archaeologists get so focused on thinking of the reasons that make sense for this thing to exist. What are the things that this item or this animal allows a human to do, when sometimes the answer is it's cool. Like, in my master's dissertation, I looked at fish bones from the site of Swandro in the Orkney Islands, which is like up north in Scotland. And I had all these fish bones. They were all like cod and stuff like that you would normally catch. But then there was a monkfish, which is like an anglerfish type of thing. It was just one jaw, and I was trying to figure out, what was it? Why would you have this? Like, why is there only one? And to be honest, I don't think I really wrote this in my thesis. I think I wrote it in a bit more academic way, but like part of me was like, maybe it was an accidental catch, and someone was like, this is kind of cool, I'm gonna keep it. That's not something that was only invented in modern times. Curiosity, it's always existed. People have always been like, that's cool, that looks interesting, I don't know what that is or what it does, I want it near me and I want to keep it. Like this has always been a part of the compulsion of human beings, and it's not one that's really well documented in the archaeological record, but it's always something I always think about, when we're like overthinking things, and it's just like, what if it's just cool? you know
That makes sense to me. Okay, so for the listener, in case you don't know what a monkfish looks like, it's one of those fish that sit on the bottom, but basically like its chin sits on the bottom of the ocean and has a huge mouth. It's like a mouth and a tail. Like that's it. They're kind of ugly. And I can imagine someone like pulling them up out of the water and being like, "What is this fish?" Especially because some of them have like beards, like a little tendrils and things like that hanging off their chin. So it compared to what stereotypical fish looks like, it's very different. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. We've talked about domestic animals,
Mhm.
and we've talked about how it's difficult to differentiate between wild and domestic animals, or at least during the process of domestication, it's hard to tell the difference.
Mhm.
So in the Cowsea Cave complex, right, you had all of these bones, some wild animals, some domestic animals, some human bones. Like, how were you able to tell the difference?
Um, I mean, so this actually probably goes back to kind of more general zooarchaeology, in that it's nice to have a reference collection to tell the difference between all of them. You were saying earlier about, well, you have to know all these species. That makes you very impressive. But here's the twist is that actually I just have a big collection of modern day animals, and I just hold the two bones up and compare them. Obviously, that does get better over time. I mean, that was how I was trained. Was basically like, you're going to start off having to look at every single bone and compare it to every single bone, but after a while you're going to start being able to shorthand it and be like, okay, that curvature means that's a pig bone. Okay, like I can do it a lot faster. But I mean, that is kind of how you have to work, because not just because there's a lot of species and you have to be able to kind of differentiate between them, but also they're not going to look nice and complete. I mean, I'm lucky if I get more than a shaft of a bone. And a shaft can be a lot of things. That's why I have a special designation, which is just called long bone fragment. And that's what every shaft fragment ends up being, unless it's like really close to the end and I can kind of figure out what it might be. But that's why you need it, so that you can kind of look at these things. And the reason why you need it for zooarchaeology is because you're dealing with not just bone fragments, which can be any bone, but you're also dealing with different species. So not only can it, okay, well, this little shaft piece can be a femur, or maybe it could be a humerus, but also I guess it could be a cow, it could be a horse. It could be a really big chicken. I don't know. Like it's a lot of things you're juggling, so you really need a reference collection to help out with that. I mean, there's some zooarchaeology superstars that are probably able to do it from their big brains of theirs. But I don't have galaxy brain yet. I have baby brain, so I do need a reference collection to do this. But you know, Cowsea Cave was such a wild thing to work at, because the other thing is that, you know, when you work on sites, you can sometimes shorthand things in the sense of you kind of know what you're dealing with. So if let's say I'm digging a farm, right? And I know it's a farm. We have evidence that it's a farm, you know, whether it's structures or text or whatever. I know it's a farm. I'm going to be like, okay, so even if I can't tell what the species is because it's really fragmented, I'm going to say it's livestock, it's a cow, it's a horse, it's a pig, you know. Those are farm animals, right? Cowsea Cave is, I used to refer to it as a later prehistoric petting zoo, because it would just get wild, because you would start off and be like, okay, there's a lot of seagull bones. That makes sense. We're near the coast. Seagulls are going to fly in. That's fine. All of a sudden, you're starting to look at bones and like, I've never seen this bone before. I look it up. I do the reference collection stuff. Sometimes you have to use, you know, just pictures if you don't have it. All of a sudden, I'm like, that's a great auk. That's an extinct bird. I don't know. Why is this in this cave? But I'm like, okay, that's still a seabird. That makes sense. Then, you know, you're still looking at stuff, and then you're like, this bone looks a bit canine. I look it up a little bit further. This is a seal. Now, again, we are on the coast, but how is a seal getting into this cave? I don't really know. That's one of the few things I've never really figured out. My favorite one is, I remember, this is after I hurt myself, so I wasn't really on site, and I was a bit traumatized, so I wasn't really like digging as much. And you know, they were sending back bags of bones, and I was doing the analysis on the fly, and they were like, you know, Alex, we found this human bone, like a human leg bone. We don't know, like, it must be a juvenile. It's really long. It's very strange. Can you look at it? So I look at it, and you know, within I think 10 minutes, I like turned back to them, and I was like, okay, so this is a crane. Well, no, I didn't know it was a crane yet, but I was like, this is a really big bird bone, not a human bone, because birds have a combined leg bone called the tibiotarsus, and humans obviously do not have that. It's a very distinct looking bird bone. So I was like, this is a really big bird bone. This is not human. I actually ended up having to go to Tring, which is like kind of outside London, to go to the natural history collection there, because they had crane bones. I didn't have any crane in my reference collection, and basically had to be like, can I just bring my bone and compare it to yours? And that's why I was able to figure out that it was crane. But yeah, the importance of a reference collection, I cannot stress this enough, because you know, and you know, that's like a very extreme example of mistaken identity, but like, there are a lot, and not even just domesticates and wild animals either. There are some bones that look very much like, the one that I always think about is rabbit bone and bird bone. There are a lot of similarities in the way it looks. I mean, if you have like a specifically fragmented one, it's really easy to swap them. So yeah, it's a lot. I mean, I think I did about 8,000 animal bones in my PhD, and then probably an extra 1,000 or so human bone. So I did a lot of back and forth reference collecting comparisons.
I have a listener question, long-time listener, first-time caller, and they're wondering, if humans and bears have similar bones, and humans and pigs have similar bones, how would you be able to identify the skeletal remains of man, bear, pig?
I mean, well, my first answer to that is, I don't live in South Park, so I don't think I would ever run into this problem. My second answer to that is that man, bear, pig actually has very distinctive morphology. It's not just a man, bear, pig per se. It's, so what I was thinking is that it's got the face of a pig, kind of, right? It's pig, bear, whatever, but it's large enough. So I would assume that the mandible area is probably very pig-like, but it's large enough that if I saw that in an archaeological assemblage, I would be able to be like, okay, well, that's way too big for a pig mandible, but it doesn't have the features you would associate with a boar. Might not have those massive tusks or whatever, or the kind of elongation that you might see in a boar. Obviously, it's man, bear, pig. But like, yeah, but there would be little things like that add up. There's, I don't think man, bear, pig would be my first guess, or my second, third, or fourth. It might be like my like 30 millionth guess when I'm like really down in the depths of not knowing. But I mean, it's the same process. There is a very distinctive morphology for any kind of weird creature. It's not just like putting one thing on top of the other thing, even though we like to imagine that. And, it would have to, if we're thinking logically, it would have to make sense, right? So, like, the morphology of a pig would have to be able to be big enough and to maintain the kind of size that we're working with. You know, yeah, that's as close as I get to a logical answer for that question.
You did your best. Thank you, Dr. Fitzpatrick. I'm sure our listener will be very pleased. What I thought was really interesting is that as you were going through the layers, right, going to the stratigraphy and going back in time, and we're like identifying the different time periods that were in this cave. Which, by the way, it's a cave, so I'm just wondering, like, how thin were the layers? But anyways, like the ratio of animals, of wild animals to domestic animals, would kind of shift over time, and I thought that was kind of interesting to see. Like, okay, in medieval times they have sheep, they like sheep, so there's a bunch of sheep bones here. But in like prehistoric times, they hadn't domesticated them yet, so no sheep bones. I mean, was there anything there that like really surprised you? Thought was interesting?
I mean, the fluctuations were really interesting, and it was one of those things that you don't really notice until you actually like graph them out, and then you start to notice these really interesting patterns. So, like, for me, and this is something I need to write up because it was just something so interesting. It was the red deer change, that they were used so much in like the early periods, and then they just kind of peter out. And for me, I assume that a lot of that has to do with the change in use. So, they might have had a very utilitarian use in the beginning, or even a somewhat more stronger ritual use. We found the kind of top of a skull in one of the sites. I think it was Cowsea Cave 2, which is, for me, felt so similar to, I don't know if you know, the star car headdress, which is like the frontlets of a deer. It was very similar
Yeah,
in look, so it's like, it's probably a ritual use. And
yeah.
but they were used so often, clearly, in like these early periods, and then they really start petering out, and like you don't really see them as much once you get to the medieval. And for me, that's like the the use of the cave changed so much that you weren't really needing to bring in red deer. In particular, the medieval period is the part that's so interesting. One, because it was not even in anyone's mind that there was medieval stuff in this cave. If you look at the title of my thesis, it's later prehistory, right? Like, it says later prehistoric in the title, because when I first joined the PhD, we were like, yeah, we have a lot later prehistoric stuff. It's just a site that's from like the Neolithic to the Iron Age. It's really interesting. Cut to, I think it's like 2019, right? I'm supposed to hand in my thesis like 6 months from now or something, like 8 months from now. I get called into a meeting with my supervisors, and they basically sit me down. They go, Alex, don't freak out. Don't freak out. We got the carbon dating back for a bunch of the sites, and we need to let you know that it's not later prehistoric, it's medieval and post-medieval. Now, the time difference between the later prehistoric and the medieval period is a lot. It's a couple thousand years, give or take. In some cases, they were like, don't freak out, don't freak out. So you might want to read this, and this about the medieval period, because I had no idea much about the medieval period at this time. And they're like, you're going to have to change a little bit of your thesis. And, it was very hectic, but it added so much to the dimension to the story. The medieval period is so interesting because clearly it's a real big case of revisitation, and very mixed case as well. We have evidence potentially of early Christians. Someone's carved a cross in the back of a sculptor's cave. There's this theory that maybe that was them seeing basically all these human remains, thinking, oh my gosh, this is a pagan site. We need to keep these spirits away from us, putting a cross in the back. And there was also, lots of hermitages and people living in caves as part of their early Christian practices. So that was a potential explanation for reuse during this time. But, there were also loads of cats around. Maybe it's witchcraft. If someone was still doing pagan practices or dabbling in witchcraft, if you come across a cave that's full of human remains and other bones, you might be like, this feels like a potential place to do my work and to, do my practice. And also, and I realized I added this as an aside to my thesis, because it's true, but I did write, like, it could have been witchcraft. There were a lot of cats around because there were a lot of cat bones.
I read that in your dissertation and I'm like, do not just drop witchcraft in the middle of your dissertation and walk away. Please explain.
I mean, that's the problem, though, is that, well, partially this was not my area of expertise whatsoever. Like, I was an Iron Age person, so I didn't have as much background to really give to the medieval period. This is something I'm kind of like trying to tackle now, like writing up my publications for my PhD years later, of course. But, I want to expand a bit on that medieval aspect because I just really didn't have the time to really focus on that because it was so out of nowhere, this whole element, and it was a huge part of the cave as well. Like, it was so much of the assemblage, we couldn't just ignore it. But witchcraft is tricky. It's just like ritual in that, it means different things to different people. It depends on the culture you're working with, the local folklore. Someone's witch is someone else's priest, right? So it's a very tricky thing to kind of identify. I think a lot of times when we think about witchcraft, we're able to kind of back it up because we have folklore, we have written texts of, people calling people out as witches or whatever. So that's something I really need to deep dive into. It was more of kind of like this could be the case because, early medieval, we are at that weird point where, the Christianity is spreading a bit more, but there's probably little pockets of non-Christian practices still happening, and this could be one of those pockets.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fitzpatrick. Is there anything last thing you want to say to the audience?
It's whatever. Do what you want to do.
Go dig up animal bones. All right. See you. Take care. Now we come to the show where we plot to kill the players. It's just me this episode, but I want to use some of the ideas that we learned with Dr. Fitzpatrick. Yeah, like a really classic way to build atmosphere in a dungeon is with bones. Like, it shows how, like, someone or something died there, with an implication that the monster's the one that did it. But did the monster do it? Like, I'm thinking that since Oak Ridge is built on an ancient burial ground, psst, don't tell Michael. It's a catacombs like in Paris. So I'm thinking like the hyenas. If you have a bunch of random bones scattered about, okay, scavengers, animals, beasts. If the bones are nicely lined up and placed with intention, burial. It's people. What's going to be kind of interesting is if I can kind of like mix that up a little. Like, you come into rooms where people are buried, but every so often you come across a room where maybe the bones are askew. You can tell that they've been messed with. And so that's going to tell you, like, okay, where the monster is. And this could be kind of fun to, like, go through the dungeon, and it's giving you kind of hints that the monster is either ahead of you or behind you or whatever. And I think that might be a really cool and creepy way to, like, mess with the players. Huh. Well, that's all we have for now. Don't be afraid to join us next time, because everyone is... Welcome to Goblin Town!